Hello everyone, and welcome to Sleep Triggers ASMR. You're about to enter a world where horror whispers gently in the dark. Where shadows tell stories, and the rain keeps you company. Tonight's tale will guide you through fear, softly wrapped in sound. Don't worry, you're safe here with me. Let the unease comfort you, and let each sound pull you deeper into rest. If you enjoy these immersive horror sleep experiences, please like, subscribe, and tap the so you'll never miss a night. I'll be here, waiting, every night, to tell you another story. Now, close your eyes. Take a deep breath. And let the story begin. Whispering Pines was the kind of town that time forgot. No highways ran through it. No chain stores, no neon lights, no billboards pointing to the nearest gas station. Just trees, tall, solemn, and watching, lining a single winding road that dipped through fog and into the center of something that didn't quite feel like a place anymore, but a memory of one. Lydia Holloway arrived at dusk. Her old Subaru creaked to a stop in front of a crooked wooden sign, half sunk into the wet grass, the letters peeling and chipped. Welcome to Whispering Pines, a place to grow. Grow. That word sat strangely on her tongue. She stepped out, gravel crunching beneath her boots. The air smelled of pine sap and stagnant rain, thick with something sweet and old. There were no sounds, no cars, no birds, no insects. Just the steady, breathing quiet of a town that didn't welcome noise. She didn't see the tree right away. Not until she rounded the bend toward Town Square. It stood taller than the old courthouse, black bark shining like wet coal under the fading light. Its branches twisted out like cracked fingers, clawing at the low sky. No leaves. No birds. Just the tree, silent, hulking, and impossibly still. Locals called it the Black Tree. Lydia would come to know it by many other names. The house she rented was old. White paint flaked from the siding like sunburnt skin. Shutters hung uneven. The porch groaned with every step. They called it the Griffin House. She hadn't asked why. A real estate agent named Eileen, gray-haired, red-lipped, too cheerful, had met her there the week before, jingling the keys like wind chimes. "Oh, don't mind the stories," Eileen had said. "Kids around here like to say things, especially about that tree. Harmless stuff. Local color." Lydia hadn't thought much of it. She was here for peace. For solitude. For the job at the elementary school that promised a quiet paycheck and enough time to write again. But as she unpacked that first night, setting boxes along creaky wooden floors, she noticed something odd. The windows wouldn't close all the way. And around 4 a.m., the back door made a noise. Just once. Click. Like someone turning the knob from the outside. Slowly. Firmly. But when she checked, no one was there. Her first week teaching passed without incident. The children were quiet. Polite. Too polite, almost. They stared a little too long. Blinked a little too slowly. And nearly every one of them, when asked to draw something during free time, drew the same thing. A tree. Tall. Black. Leafless. Each drawing had little variations, sometimes eyes in the bark, sometimes mouths on the branches. One child, a boy named Caleb, handed her his picture with a crooked smile. "The tree told me I can go with Mommy soon," he said. Lydia blinked. "What do you mean, sweetie?" "She's waiting there," he replied simply, pointing to the tree he had drawn. "Right under it." She tried to gently steer the conversation away. Told herself it was just a child processing grief. She had seen the file. Caleb's mother had died the year before. Still, she kept the drawing. Something about it lingered. The next morning, Caleb didn't show up to class. By noon, whispers started spreading in the halls. "Another one," a teacher muttered near the copier. That afternoon, Lydia overheard the principal on the phone, speaking low and fast. "Yes, sir." "Same thing." "Left bed during the night." "No sign." "We've searched the property." Her stomach turned. She drove home with her hands tight on the wheel, the sun dipping low behind the thick trees. When she passed the town square, she slammed on the brakes. She wasn't sure what made her stop. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the flicker of movement out the corner of her eye. At the base of the black tree, there was something new. A pair of small, blue sneakers. Placed neatly together, side by side. Just like in Caleb's drawing. She didn't get out of the car. She didn't breathe. She drove the rest of the way home without looking back. The dreams began that night. Lydia dreamed of doors. Endless rows of them, each one slightly ajar. Behind them, a sound, wet, slow breathing. And crying. A baby's crying. Not sharp, but hollow. As if muffled through water. She woke up drenched in sweat, her sheets tangled around her ankles. On her windowsill were 5 leaves. Dry. Curling. Black vein. She hadn't opened the window. By the 3rd night, the dreams began to follow her into waking. She saw faces in reflections. Smiling when she wasn't. She heard footsteps above her bedroom, even though no one lived upstairs. She began to notice that every clock in her house would stop at exactly 4 a.m. And at that moment, every night, the back door would make that same sound. Click. She told herself it was stress. New job. New town. But then she returned to Caleb's drawing, and for the first time, noticed something she hadn't before. In the upper corner, almost too small to see, was a house. Her house. And in the window, a figure with no face. She started asking questions. Most locals didn't want to answer. They smiled too widely or changed the subject. One woman at the grocery store muttered under her breath, "You're living too close to the roots, dear." Lydia found old newspaper archives at the library. Thin microfilm strips, dusty folders. Most were incomplete. But over the last 70 years, she found at least 17 cases of missing children. Same pattern. Same age range. Same time of night. And in each case, there was always someone who had seen the child last. Standing beneath the black tree. On the 7th night, Lydia stayed up. She sat at her window, wrapped in a thick red scarf loaned by the grocer's wife. "Keeps the dreams off you," the woman had whispered. She set up a camera, lit a candle, watched the clock. At 3:58, the air shifted. The shadows in her living room leaned toward the back door. At exactly 4 a.m., the door clicked. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a steady, firm turn, like fingers remembering the weight of a handle. She stood. She walked slowly to the door. She opened it. The night outside was not the same night she had seen before. The porch opened into a clearing she didn't recognize. Mist covered the ground like a living thing. The town was gone. The trees were taller. Bent inward. Breathing. And in the center of the fog, the black tree. Only now, it was moving. Its trunk rose and fell with breath. Its branches reached slowly outward, as if stretching after sleep. And from somewhere deep within it, she heard a voice. Not with her ears, but inside her skull. A whisper. "You smell it, don't you? The soil is full of eyes." She stumbled back, slammed the door, bolted it. Her candle had gone out. The leaves on her floor had rearranged themselves into a circle. And from upstairs, though she hadn't set foot up there since moving in, came the sound of soft, deliberate footsteps. She didn't sleep after that. Lydia sat in the hallway with a kitchen knife and a dying flashlight, her back against the bedroom door. The hours bled together. At some point, the sky outside began to pale. The world shifted from black to gray to a muted blue, like bruised skin. The footsteps upstairs had stopped. But the silence was worse. It felt thick. Suspended. Like the house was holding its breath. She didn't remember dozing off, but when she woke, the flashlight had rolled across the floor, and her candle, burnt down to a wax stub, sat beside it. And the circle of black leaves had grown. She spent the next day scrubbing the floors. Bleach. Vinegar. Salt. Things she remembered from stories her grandmother used to tell. Old Southern superstitions. Kitchen magic, passed down with a wink and a warning. When the house goes quiet, make it loud again. Open every window. Stir the air. Don't let shadows settle. So Lydia opened windows. She turned on every light. played static from the radio. Left the TV on in the guest room, even though she never used it. But the silence in Whispering Pines was different. It wasn't the kind that waited. It was the kind that listened. At school, Caleb's desk remained empty. The kids didn't talk about him. They didn't even glance at his seat. During art hour, they still drew the tree. But something had changed. Their pictures were darker now. More detailed. One girl, Mia, drew a face in the bark of the trunk. A mouth, open in a scream, with little stick figure arms reaching out of it. When Lydia gently asked what it was, Mia replied, "That's where the inside starts. It's not really wood." "Inside of what, sweetie?" Mia blinked slowly. "The underneath. Where it keeps them." Lydia folded the drawing and slipped it into her bag. That afternoon, she stopped by the sheriff's office. The office was empty. Not closed, just unmanned. A single bell jingled as she walked in, echoing into the stillness. The air inside smelled like coffee and mildew and something else, like old clothes sealed in plastic. A nameplate sat on the front desk. Sheriff Paul Tupper. She waited. Knocked on the counter. Called out. Nothing. Then, from behind a side door, a voice. "I wouldn't waste your time, Miss Holloway." It was Eileen, the real estate agent. She stepped into view, holding a Tupperware of cookies. Her smile was too bright, her lipstick too red. "He won't talk to you. Sheriff Tupper's got a policy, says what the town forgets, the town survives. And we've survived just fine. I need to report a missing child." Eileen tilted her head. "Now, who says he's missing?" Lydia's jaw tightened. "He's not in his home. Or at school. And maybe that's where he wants to be," Eileen said softly. "Not all disappearances are tragedies." Lydia stared at her. "What's that supposed to mean?" The woman's expression didn't change. But her voice dropped half a register. "Some of us go looking for it. Some of us are chosen. That tree doesn't take. It calls." Lydia took a step back. The sheriff never came out. That night, she returned to the town square. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to know if they were still there. The shoes. She found them at 2:17 a.m., under the tree, just as before. But this time, there was something new. Carved into the bark of the trunk, just above where the shoes sat, was a name. Caleb Holloway. She stood frozen. Her hands trembled. Her breath caught in her throat. Holloway. Her name. Not his. The sound came again. Not loud. Not sharp. But deep. A low, quick groan from inside the tree. Like something turning over in its sleep. Like something pressing against the inside of the bark, testing it. She turned and ran. The night around her warped. The town was too quiet. The street lamps flickered in sequence, like eyes blinking slowly. The trees on the edge of the square leaned slightly inward. When she reached the edge of her driveway, she fell to her knees. And when she looked up, her front door was open. She had locked it. She was sure. But it hung wide now, yawning into the dark. Her hallway light blinked. A slow strobe. Her television in the guest room played static at full volume. And on the bottom step of the stairs, something waited. Not a figure. Not a person. Just an object. Caleb's backpack. Folded. Zipped. Unmarked. Lydia approached it with shaking hands. Inside, a drawing. It showed the tree again. But now, there were 3 figures beneath it. All identical. All faceless. All reaching up toward its limbs. And on the back of the page, in jagged crayon scrawl, "We're all inside now. You should come too." She called the police that night. But no one answered. The line rang, then cut. Rang, then hissed. On the 5th try, the operator answered with a single phrase. "This number is no longer in use." Then, click. Silence. By sunrise, she had made a decision. She was leaving. The town. The school. Everything. She didn't pack much. Just a duffel, her laptop, some clothes. But as she turned the key in the ignition, she noticed something in her rearview mirror. A shape. Standing at the edge of the woods behind her house. Not a person. Not quite. It looked like a silhouette carved from tree bark, with limbs that bent the wrong way, and a head that tilted too far. No face. Just the outline. It raised one arm, slowly, gently, and pointed toward her. And then, in her back seat. Rustling. Lydia spun. No one was there. Only leaves. Black vein. Curled. Forming a neat circle on the seat behind her. She didn't drive away that day. Because when she opened her phone to check the GPS, the map showed nothing. No roads. No highways. No signal. Just a blinking red dot labeled, "You are here." And around it, nothing but green. Trees. The whispers started again that night. This time, closer. Not in dreams. Not in memory. In her walls. Behind the plaster. Between the pipes. Little voices. Familiar voices. Children. Don't fight it, Miss Holloway. The tree is home. We're just roots now. And then, quiet. Until, from upstairs, the sound of something large dragging across the floor. The dragging sound didn't stop. It paused. Shifted. Scraped again. Heavy, deliberate, like a piece of furniture being moved slowly, but not by hands that understood what furniture was for. Lydia sat at the foot of the stairs, knife in her lap. Her cell phone, useless. The house cold, even though the thermostat still blinked 71. Upstairs, something moved again. A sharp creak, followed by a shudder of footsteps. But they weren't walking. It sounded like crawling. She counted the steps. 1, 2, 3. The sound stopped just past the landing, right above the ceiling, where Caleb's room used to be. And then, a whisper. Not from inside the room, but from the attic above it. A voice like dry leaves crumbling. "Come see me." Lydia didn't answer. She held her breath until her ribs ached. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You left the door open." She stood. Against every instinct screaming inside her, she climbed the stairs. Each step felt like falling forward into deeper silence. When she reached the top, the hallway light flickered once, then went dark. The attic door had never been opened before. A pull string dangled from the ceiling. A ladder now extended, almost lovingly, like the house had decided to share a secret. Cold air leaked down. The whisper came once more. "You remember me." Lydia climbed the ladder. Her hand found the top rung. The attic smelled like dust and something else: wet wood, rotting paper, iron. She peeked her head through the opening and stopped breathing. The attic was full of drawings. Hundreds of them. Taped to the walls, strung up with twine, stacked in damp cardboard boxes. All of them showed the same thing. The black tree. But not how it looked from the town square. In these drawings, the tree was bigger. Bent. Sometimes it had a face. Sometimes it had many. And around the roots, always children. Hands reaching out. Eyes blank. Mouths stitched shut or wide open in a scream. She recognized Caleb's drawings. But there were others. Signed with different names. Liam. Sarah. Jonah. Maddie. Some from years ago. Decades. In the corner of the attic, something moved. Slowly. Delicately. Like something trying not to be seen. Lydia raised her flashlight. The beam cut through the dark. It landed on a shape, crouched in the far corner beneath the eaves. Small. Child-sized. It was facing the wall. Its back looked almost human, but wrong. Too thin. Skin stretched tight across bones. The head was hairless, pale. The ears pointed slightly back, like deer ears. It was humming. A broken, wheezing tune. Like a lullaby sung through water. Then it stopped. The figure turned. Its eyes were stitched shut. Its mouth wasn't. That mouth opened, impossibly wide. Inside, no teeth, just rows of black leaves curling in on themselves, as if growing from the throat. And then it spoke. "You left me under the tree." Lydia screamed. She fell back down the attic ladder, landing hard on her shoulder. Something cracked. But she didn't stop. She scrambled backward down the hall, dragging herself into the bathroom. She slammed the door, locked it, and from the hallway, laughter. High, sweet, childlike, but double, like two voices laughing in perfect sync. Then silence. She stayed in the bathroom until dawn. When she opened the door, the ladder was gone. So were the footsteps. The attic. Even the drawings. It was like none of it had ever been there. The next morning, she tried to leave again. She packed her car, made it down the road, past the diner, past the gas station. But when she reached the highway, it wasn't there. The road just looped back around, through the woods, past the school, past the black tree, back to her house. Every time. That night, she slept with the lights on. But dreams found her anyway. She dreamed of roots, of vines coiling through her bed frame, of mouths hidden in her walls, whispering old nursery rhymes in voices that sounded like Caleb's. And she dreamed of digging. Not in the yard. In her chest. She clawed through skin and bone and pulled out a single black seed. It pulsed in her hand. Then opened an eye. She woke screaming. And for a second, she thought she was still dreaming. Because the room was filled with the smell of soil. Fresh. Damp. Wet. And on her nightstand, a small pile of dirt. At the center, a seed. Black. Vein. Breathing. By now, she had stopped trying to explain things. She didn't go to the police. She didn't call the school. She didn't tell her sister, or her old coworkers back in Atlanta. Because part of her, some deep, old part, knew no one could help. This wasn't a haunting. This was an invitation. And she had already RSVP'd. On the fourth night, she returned to the tree. She needed to know. Not just where Caleb had gone. But why the town didn't care. Why the children never screamed. Why her name was on the trunk. The shoes were gone this time. But something new had appeared. A mirror. Old. Full length. The kind you find in antique stores. Leaning against the base of the tree. It hadn't been there before. Not in any of her visits. In the reflection, there was no tree. Just woods. Dark and endless and writhing, like they were moving in slow time. And in the center, a child. Small. Still. Covered in black leaves. Face hidden. But in his hand, her car keys. Lydia stepped forward. The air around the mirror was cold. Warmer behind her. The tree pulsed. Like it was breathing in reverse. She reached toward the glass. And as her fingers touched it, the reflection moved. The child looked up and smiled. But it wasn't Kayla. It was her. At 6 years old. Standing beneath a tree that wasn't the same, but was also exactly the same. And whispering. We never left. We just forgot. In 3rd grade, Lydia remembered a game. It started as a dare. Someone, she couldn't remember who, had whispered it during lunch one rainy afternoon, long before she left Whispering Pines the first time. The rules were simple. Sit in the dark. Light a candle. Say the words, I hear you whisper. Wait. Don't break the circle. They called it the whispering game. Just a stupid thing kids did in small towns where nothing ever really happened. Except something had happened. A girl named Rebecca Jennings went missing the week after they played. Lydia hadn't thought about that game in over 20 years. Until now. Because when she woke up the next morning, the words were written on her mirror. Not in lipstick. Not in marker. But carved. Thin, delicate scratches in the glass. Like fingernails. I hear you whisper. She didn't scream this time. She just sat on the bed and stared at the words. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that pressed against your ears, waiting for you to notice it. Downstairs, the front door creaked open. Then shut. Footsteps. Small. Bare. Padding across the kitchen floor. Lydia got up. She walked to the door. Pressed her ear to it. No sound. She opened it slowly. The hallway was empty. The candle she kept on the table flickered once, then flared, bright white, and went out. She picked it up. The wax was warm. Still fresh. Someone, or something, had lit it. She didn't tell herself she was crazy anymore. That part of her brain was gone now. Peeled back like bark from a tree. Something had replaced it. A memory she didn't remember having. A room in the woods. A circle of candles. Children sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed. Lydia among them. Saying the words. I hear you whisper. And then the sound of something moving in the walls. Behind the plaster. Behind the wood. Inside the house. She lit the candle again. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. She sat on the living room floor, cross-legged, the way she had when she was 8. And she whispered the words. I hear you whisper. The flame flickered. Dipped low. She waited. No sound. No wind. Just the house breathing. Then, A voice. Not from in front of her, or behind, but from inside the walls. Soft, playful, young. Then listen. The room went cold. Not like the heater had failed again. This was different. The air felt wrong. Heavy. Like something old had taken a step forward after years of waiting. The candle went out. And she was no longer in her living room. She was sitting on dirt. Surrounded by trees. A ring of them. Bent. Twisted. Bark like flaking skin. The sky above was too low, gray and wet, like a ceiling painted to look like clouds. In front of her were the children. Some familiar. Some not. All with mouths sewn shut. But their eyes were locked on hers. One of them stepped forward. A boy. Maybe 10. Hair matted with mud. Clothes stained. He raised a hand and pointed. Behind Lydia. She turned. The black tree. But bigger than ever. Towering. Crawling. Its roots moved like fingers dragging themselves across a dry sea. At the base of the tree, a hole. Not a door. Not a cave. A mouth. Wider than anything had the right to be. Inside it, darkness. Moving. The boy spoke, not aloud, but into her. You came back. That means you remember. That means you belong. Lydia shook her head. I'm not one of you. But the children smiled. All of them. In perfect unison. And whispered. You will be. She blinked, and the forest was gone. She was back in her living room. The candle was melted into a puddle of wax. The lights were off. Her phone was dead. And on the walls, new scratches. Hundreds of them. Etched into the drywall like claws had been dragged through it. Words, repeating over and over. I hear you whisper. I hear you whisper. I hear you whisper. She ran. Out the door. Down the porch steps. Into the street. But the town was wrong. Empty. Storefronts boarded up. Windows blackened. Cars rusted. Weeds growing up through the pavement. The diner gone. The school collapsed. The gas station missing entirely. It was like she had stepped 50 years forward, or backward. She wasn't in Whispering Pines anymore. Not the one she remembered. Not the one that existed in maps. She was somewhere else. At the center of it all, where the park used to be, the black tree stood taller. Reaching. Leaning toward her. And beneath it, a child's body. Small. Face down. Wearing a red jacket. Caleb's jacket. She screamed. Ran. But the streets didn't end. They just curved. Like a spiral. Like a labyrinth designed to bring her back. And when she reached her house again, because of course she did, the front door was already open. The lights inside flickered on. The house was waiting. On the kitchen table, a photo album. Not hers. But familiar. She opened it. Pages of black and white pictures. Children standing beside the black tree. Always the same angle. Always the same expression, neutral. Blank. Staring forward. Some were labeled. Then. Lydia, age 6. And beside her. Rebecca Jennings. The girl who went missing after playing the whispering game. Lydia touched the photo. The air shifted. From upstairs, footsteps. Slow. Bare. But not one set. 2. Then 4. Then more. Moving down the stairs. Not rushing. Not sneaking. Just coming. Lydia backed into the living room. The lights flickered. Then died. And in the dark. Whispers. Everywhere. In the walls. In the vents. In her own bones. 1,000 voices, speaking at once. I hear you whisper. Now hear us. And then. Hands. Small. Cold. Dozens of them. Grabbing her from the shadows. Not to hurt. To pull her into the circle. The game had started again. And this time, no one was breaking the circle. Lydia didn't remember falling asleep. But she remembered waking up. And this time, it wasn't her bed. She was on a wooden floor. The boards beneath her were old, soft, swollen with time. The room smelled like rot and rust. Like wet carpet and old blood. She sat up slowly. The room had no corners. Literally. Every wall was slightly curved, blending into the floor, into the ceiling, into each other. There were no hard edges. No sharp transitions. Just soft, bending wood, like the inside of something living. Like a rib cage. She whispered into the dark, her voice trembling. Hello. The sound didn't bounce. It just died. Swallowed by the room. A light flickered above. Dim, yellow. Sickly. Not electric. Not fire. It came from a bulb, but there were veins wrapped around the cord. Like the light itself had grown here. Birthed from the ceiling. The air buzzed. Not from insects. But from breathing. Something, somewhere, breathing very slowly. She stood. Her legs were weak, like they'd been asleep for days. There were no doors. Only a hallway that pulsed open like a wound. So she walked. Because what else was there to do? The hallway narrowed the farther she went. Not visually. Physically. The walls pressed in. The floor tilted downward. She had to crouch, then crawl. Everything smelled warmer now. Like body heat. Like something sleeping just ahead. She reached a bend in the hall. And then, she heard it again. The whisper. Right in her ear. Don't look back. She froze. She didn't remember hearing footsteps. But she felt them. Right behind her. Slow. Wet. Bare. And they stopped when she stopped. She closed her eyes. Bit her lip. And kept moving forward. The passage opened into a room. At least, she thought it was a room. It was vast, hollow, like the inside of a tree trunk, but wrong. The walls weren't wood anymore. They were flesh. Pink and black and throbbing, like a lung slowly breathing in reverse. In the center of the room. A mirror. Tall. Old. Cracked down the middle. Carved into the frame. We remember what you forgot. She stepped toward it. Her reflection stared back. Except it wasn't her. Not exactly. The woman in the mirror was younger. 8 years old. Red jacket. Mud on her knees. Her mouth was moving, but Lydia heard no sound. She leaned closer. The girl in the mirror whispered something. So soft, the glass didn't even fog. Lydia pressed her palm to the surface. And felt fingers press back. Then, the glass cracked. Split down the middle. And the girl on the other side smiled. Too wide. Too many teeth. And no eyes. The mirror shattered. Not out, but inward. Like it had been sucked into itself. And behind it. Another hallway. Lydia stepped through. Now the rooms came faster. Each one worse than the last. Room 1. A nursery. Crib in the corner. Walls covered in children's drawings. Every single drawing showed the same thing. The black tree. And something hanging from it. Room 2. A kitchen. Table set for dinner. But the plates were full of teeth. Human teeth. All sizes. Some still bloody. Room 3. Her childhood bedroom. Exactly as she remembered it. Same posters. Same lamp. Same pink blanket. But the bed was occupied. By her mother. Mouth open. Eyes sewn shut. Whispering something with no voice. Lydia ran. Down the next hall. Up a staircase that bent sideways. She came to a door. Finally, a door. She opened it. And stepped into the woods. It was night. The black tree towered above her. At its base, a door. She hadn't seen it before. Not when she was a child. Not last night. Not in her dreams. It was tall. Wood. Covered in carvings. She approached. Carvings like names. So many of them. Some faded. Some freshly scratched. Rebecca Jennings. Noah Reed. Mara Fletcher. Caleb Mercer. And at the bottom, Lydia and Vale. Scratched deep. Still bleeding. She reached for the handle. And the whisper came again. This time from inside her own head. Welcome home. The door swung inward. No hinges. No sound. Just darkness. But it smelled familiar. Like pine and wet earth and old fears. She stepped inside. And the door slammed shut. There were no windows. No light. No echo. Just the sound of Lydia's footsteps on soft earth, and something distant, like water dripping onto stone. Slow. Intermittent. Like a clock ticking in a room long abandoned. She reached out, feeling for a wall. Her fingers touched nothing but damp air. Then, softly, beneath her breath, she heard children laughing. Not from ahead. From above. She froze. Looked up. The ceiling was moving. Not shifting. Breathing. A pale, fleshy expanse arched high overhead, veined like parchment left in water, inflating and deflating slowly. With each breath, the walls curved slightly inward, pulling tighter around her. She pressed on. The hallway, if it could be called that, curved like a serpent, with no clear end. The further she walked, the warmer it became. Moist air clung to her skin like fog. She couldn't tell if she was walking deeper underground or if the ground itself had risen up to swallow her. Then the laughter came again. This time, closer. Right around the bend. She didn't want to see them. But she turned anyway. And there they were. 3 children, standing in a circle. All of them barefoot. All wearing white pajamas stained at the knees. Their heads were bowed, hands clasped together like a game of Ring Around the Rosie. But they weren't singing. Their mouths were wide open, eyes shut tight, heads twitching at irregular intervals, as if in the middle of a seizure. And yet the laughter continued. Coming from them, but not from their mouths. The sound was wrong. Distorted. Too clean. Like it had been recorded long ago and played back through something broken. Lydia stepped forward. And all 3 stopped. Their heads snapped up in unison. Eyes wide open. Empty. Just black holes rimmed with red. One of them, a boy with freckles, spoke. But not in his own voice. In hers. We never left. She stepped back. The children opened their mouths. Too wide. Far too wide. Their jaws cracked. Split. Open to their collars like broken marionettes. And from within, a fourth voice. Soft. Adult. Male. Lydia. She turned. There was no one behind her. When she looked back, the children were gone. The corridor began to shift. Literally. The floor stretched beneath her like taffy, warping. She fell to one knee as gravity twisted, and the ceiling dipped like the inside of a mouth preparing to close. The walls squeezed inward. Not in a straight collapse, but like muscle contracting. She crawled. The ceiling drooped low, touching her back. The passage ahead lit with a soft red glow, as if something enormous was breathing behind it, casting pulses of color from its throat. She didn't scream. Couldn't. There was no space for sound anymore. The hallway opened into a chamber. And everything stopped. There were beds. Rows and rows of rusted bunk beds, aligned like a camp dormitory. Each one covered in mossy blankets and stained sheets. And each one, occupied. Children lay beneath the covers. Dozens of them. All still. Some had faces. Some did not. Some had only masks. Handmade. Crudely carved. Painted with eyes and mouths that didn't line up. And above each bed, nailed into the wood, was a name. Lydia walked past slowly, reading them one by one. Catherine M. Tommy J. Sasha K. Nathan V. Her fingers brushed the edge of one bed frame. The body beneath twitched and turned over. She stopped breathing. The child beneath the blanket whispered, "Why didn't you come back?" Lydia didn't answer. She couldn't. She didn't even know who they were. But she felt it in her spine, the guilt. The cold, forgotten kind. As if she'd once known this place. As if she'd once left it. Something clattered behind her. She spun. A girl was sitting up on the furthest bunk. Her mask was missing. Lydia gasped. The girl looked just like her. 8 years old. Red jacket. Muddy knees. Hair matted. Eyes wide. But empty. Hollow. The girl stood. And pointed. Toward a wooden door at the back of the room. It hadn't been there before. On it, carved in bold letters. The forgotten go first. The child Lydia, the memory, the shade, the lie, said softly. They're waiting. Lydia approached the door, every step heavier than the last. As she reached for the handle, the lights above flickered. Each bed began to shake. Children sat up, one by one. Each of them looked toward her. Blank eyes. Mask eyes. Some with no eyes at all. Their mouths opened in unison. And they sang. The song had no words. Just a melody from some old world. A minor key lullaby, made of breath and bone and hunger. It filled her head like fog, She turned the handle and stepped through. The room beyond was a chapel, or something pretending to be one. Stone walls, aisles lined with pews. But everything was wrong. The windows were black. The altar was a mirror, cracked again. And in the pews sat the faceless. Dozens of them. Adults now. Each in tattered Sunday clothes. Hands folded. Heads bowed. Faces smooth and blank, as if scrubbed clean by fire. Lydia stepped forward. The congregation raised their heads, but did not look at her. They looked through her, as though she were glass. And then, they spoke. All together. You left us here. She backed away. The mirror on the altar pulsed. Blood pooled at its base. She didn't want to approach, but she knew she had to. She stood before it. Her reflection smiled back. Not her, but something pretending to be. It raised a hand and pointed upward. Lydia looked up. And there it was again. The black tree. Its roots stretching into the ceiling. Its trunk passing through stone like it wasn't there. Its branches splitting the sky. And hanging from its limbs. Children. All of them. Dozens. Hundreds. Some swaying gently. Some still. Some looking down at her. All whispering. We never left. The floor cracked. Split open. Roots curled from beneath, dragging the pews, the congregation, the entire chapel downward into red, breathing earth. Lydia stood still, unmoving, because she understood now. This was not a dream. It wasn't even a nightmare. It was remembrance. She had been here. She had been one of them. But she had been pulled out. Saved. Taken. Forgotten. The rest were left behind. And now the black tree wanted balance. The roots reached for her. Softly. Like fingers seeking forgiveness. She did not run. She only whispered, I'm sorry. And the roots wrapped gently around her ankles. Lifting her. Raising her. Toward the branches. Toward the sky. Toward the whispering pine. Sheriff Avery Malone sat alone in his office at 3:17 a.m., staring at the cardboard box on his desk like it was ticking. The label read, Whispering Pines, Missing Children, 1962 to 1998, Do Not Destroy. The letters were typed on a yellowing sticker, crooked. A faint reddish smudge darkened the top left corner. He couldn't tell if it was old ink or dried blood. The box had appeared on his desk without warning. No delivery slip. No one on the night staff had seen who brought it in. He hadn't opened it for 3 days. But something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the wind outside, How it howled through the cracks of the old jailhouse like children whimpering into pillows. Maybe it was the call he'd gotten from Lydia Marshall. Or maybe it was the dream. The same one he'd been having since he moved back to Whispering Pines. The one with the names. Names that didn't belong to anyone. He opened the box. Inside, stacked in careful layers, were thin manila folders, each with a name, date, and case number. Some were thick, filled with typed notes, interview transcripts, and black and white photos. Others were nearly empty, just a name and a date. Avery pulled out the first one on the top. Marin Cole, age 9, disappeared May 7, 1968. There was a photo clipped to the corner, a small girl with a heavy brow and long, curly hair. She was smiling, holding a toy that looked like a stuffed possum. Avery turned the page. The next was an incident report from 1968, written in faded typewriter ink. Last seen near the old fire tower on Black Hollow Trail. No signs of struggle. Search parties deployed. No remains found. He kept going. One after another. Clara Jean Worth, 11 to 1971. Danny Fisher, 6 to 1975. Annabelle Drake, 8 to 1976. Raymond R.J. Myers, 10 to 1978. Some had police reports. Others only had handwritten notes from grieving parents, letters to the sheriff begging for more time, more dogs, more money. And then, near the bottom of the box, he found one that made his throat close. Lydia Marshall, age 9, missing, July 19, 1995. He blinked. Lydia Marshall was not missing. She was very much alive. She'd called him earlier that evening, frantic, incoherent, saying things about a tree that remembers, and rooms that breathe. She begged him to find the names. She told him, they'll try to vanish again. Don't let them. And yet, here she was. Listed. Filed. Forgotten. He turned the folder over. There was no content. Just the name. No photo. No report. Just a blank page. And on the back of that page, something handwritten in charcoal. She came back wrong. He set it down carefully. Something in the air shifted. A sudden pressure, like the room itself was listening. He turned back to the box. And found something new at the bottom. Not a folder. A map. Old and yellow, the kind used by surveyors in the 40s, with faded ink and broken creases. It showed Whispering Pines and the surrounding woods. But this version had something he'd never seen before. A place circled in red. No name. Just coordinates, 42.3667 N, 74.9960 W. He recognized the general location. It was deep in the forest, behind a long-abandoned campground called Shadows Hollow. And just below the coordinates, written in the same sharp charcoal, where the names go. The next morning, Avery packed a bag and left before sunrise. No sirens. No backup. No radio. Just his truck, a flashlight, a GPS, and the map. He reached the tree line around 6 a.m. The woods were dense here, thicker than any place in the county. Birds didn't chirp. Insects didn't hum. The trees leaned inward, like they were keeping secrets. The deeper he went, the quieter it got. Until finally, he reached it. There was no sign. No clearing. No trailhead. Just a narrow depression in the earth, shaped like a trench or a collapsed tunnel. The soil was black and moist, peppered with small, unfamiliar bones. At the center of the hollow stood a structure. Not man-made. Not natural either. It looked like a tree at first, tall, crooked, black as ash. But it was smoother than bark. Too smooth. And its base was surrounded by wooden stakes, each with a name carved in crude lettering. Marin. Clara. Danny. Lydia. Hundreds of them. Some were burned. Some cracked in half. Some had been dug out of the ground and hammered back in upside down. Avery approached, hand on his holstered gun, knowing full well it wouldn't help. Because as he stepped closer, he saw. The roots moved. Tiny tremors, like worms twisting in wet soil. And from somewhere deep beneath, he heard. Breathing. The black tree pulsed. Like a lung. Like a throat. And then, from its center, a crack opened. Vertical. Like a mouth. From inside, a sliver of mirror. No, glass. Like a window. Avery looked. And what he saw made him forget how to breathe. He saw himself, much younger, maybe 10, maybe 12, standing in the woods at dusk, watching something climb out of a hole in the ground. It wasn't human. It wore his mother's face. And it called his name. He saw himself run. And never tell a soul. He saw a version of Whispering Pines where the missing children returned, quiet, changed, empty-eyed, and how the town pretended not to notice. How every generation forgot a little more. Until the forgetting became tradition. Until the names no longer meant anything. Just stories. Just legends. Just shadows beneath the pines. The vision faded. The glass sealed shut. And in the silence that followed, Avery Malone understood. The black tree didn't just hold the forgotten. It fed on them. On what people refused to see. On what they buried, emotionally, legally, historically. Every name not spoken. Every case closed without closure. Every child called a runaway when they weren't. This was where the names went. This was where the truth went to rot. And Lydia, somehow, had found her way back. But if she could come back, others might, too. Others that weren't supposed to. The stakes began to shake. The earth opened slightly. Whispers rose from the soil, hundreds of voices, all whispering the same word. Remember. Avery dropped to his knees. He pulled a notebook from his pack. And for the next 3 hours, he copied down every name. Every carved letter. Even the broken ones. Even the ones upside down. He couldn't let them disappear again. Not this time. Not now. When he finished, the black tree stopped breathing. For a moment. Just one. And then, it laughed. Sheriff Avery Malone left Shadows Hollow with a heavy heart, the weight of the black tree pressing on his mind like a lead chain. The names he'd copied still danced behind his eyelids in the dead of night, whispers curling like smoke, refusing to be ignored. The small town of Whispering Pines had never felt so cold. Back in his office, the sun filtering weakly through the dusty blinds, Avery stared at the notebook on his desk. The ink was fresh, but the names within it were ghosts, lost children who should have been alive but were not. Or were they? He wasn't sure anymore. He needed answers. And he knew where to start. The next morning, Avery drove through the town's main street, glancing at the familiar storefronts and the faces of people who had lived in Whispering Pines their entire lives. He stopped at the local diner, a place where secrets had a habit of bubbling under the surface. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and fried eggs filled the air. The usual crowd nursed their breakfasts, speaking in hushed tones. At a corner booth, he spotted a woman he hadn't seen in years, Martha Grayson, the town librarian. She was the unofficial keeper of Whispering Pines history and rumors. If anyone knew the stories behind the missing children, it was her. Avery slid into the booth opposite her. "Martha," he began quietly, "I need to talk about the children. About the ones who disappeared." She looked up slowly, her eyes dark and tired. "You mean the hollow ones?" He blinked. "Hollow ones?" She nodded. "That's what people called them, those kids who came back, but, not really." Martha reached into her purse and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. The cover was cracked and stained with age. "This," she said, placing it on the table, "is a collection of stories, notes, and eyewitness accounts from over the decades. It's unofficial, mostly passed around in whispers. But it's all true." Avery opened the book. The first page was filled with faded handwriting. "They don't come back whole. Hollowed out. Empty where their souls should be. Their eyes don't see you. Their voices don't call your name. They are the ones who slip through the cracks, and the town pretends not to see." He turned the pages. There were photographs of children, some smiling, others with faces blurred or scratched out. Handwritten notes described strange behaviors, sudden silences, nightmares, sleepwalking, speaking in tongues no one understood. One entry caught his eye. In 1983, the Miller twins returned after being missing for 3 days. They walked into their house like shadows, never speaking a word. The next morning, they disappeared again, only this time, they left no trace. Martha looked up. "The hollow ones," she said, "are the ones the black tree forgot to keep. Or maybe it let them go for a time. But they're always pulled back. Because the forest wants balance. The tree feeds on their fear, their silence." That night, Avery sat on the porch of his childhood home, notebook in hand, pondering Martha's words. The wind stirred the pines around him, and faint whispers slipped through the branches. He thought about Lydia Marshall, how she had returned, but changed. What had happened to her during those years unaccounted for? Had she been hollowed out too? A sudden knock on the door startled him. He opened it to find Lydia standing there, pale and trembling, her eyes wide with fear. "They're coming," she whispered. "The hollow ones. They never really left." Over the next weeks, Avery and Lydia delved deeper into the mystery. They interviewed residents, reluctant witnesses, haunted parents, and those who claimed to have seen the children wandering the woods at night, their faces blank, their steps hollow. They uncovered a pattern. Every few decades, a wave of disappearances swept through Whispering Pines. And every time, some children came back, changed, silent, hollow. The townspeople knew. They feared it. But they said nothing. Because speaking the names meant inviting the forest's hunger. Because the black tree demanded silence. One night, Avery found himself drawn back to Shadow's Hollow. The black tree stood like a sentinel against the moonlight, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly glow. From the darkness, figures emerged. Children. But their eyes were empty wells of blackness. They drifted towards him, whispering, "Remember us. Remember what you forgot." Avery felt a coldness seep into his bones. He wanted to run. But his feet were rooted. The hollow ones circled him, their voices rising in a mournful chant that echoed through the trees. "We come for the names. For the silence. For the forgotten." The next morning, Avery awoke in the woods, the notebook clutched in his hand. He was alone. But the names were still there. Written now not in ink, but in the bark of the black tree itself. And as dawn broke, the whispers followed him home, promising that the story was far from over. Sheriff Avery Malone couldn't shake the feeling that Whispering Pines was holding its breath. The air was thick, as if the very town itself was waiting for something to break the silence. After the encounter with the hollow ones beneath the black tree, Avery found himself drifting through his days like a ghost. The notebook with the carved names had become his lifeline, and his curse. Every night, when the world fell quiet, the whispers returned. They no longer just whispered to him. Now, they echoed through the town, faint, but unmistakable. He knew the people heard them too. He just didn't know if they dared to admit it. That evening, Avery sat in the dim light of his office, a fresh cup of black coffee cooling by his side. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at the old church at midnight. Come alone." No signature. No explanation. He hesitated, then replied. Why? No response. At midnight, the fog clung to the streets like a living thing. Avery parked across from the dilapidated church on Maple Avenue. The once grand building was boarded up, stained by years of rain and neglect. He stepped inside through a broken side door. The air smelled of damp wood and forgotten prayers. A figure waited at the altar, shrouded in shadow. Sheriff Malone, the voice was low, gravelly. You're finally ready to know the truth. The figure stepped forward, an elderly man, eyes sharp and calculating. He introduced himself as Reverend Caleb Hargrove, a lifelong resident and once a respected preacher. I've been watching, Hargrove said. Waiting for someone brave enough to confront the Black Trees Pact. Avery frowned. Pact? Hargrove nodded solemnly. Whispering Pines isn't just a town. It's a bargain. A deal struck decades ago between the founders and something ancient. The Black Tree isn't just a tree, it's a sentinel, a gatekeeper. The Reverend's eyes gleamed. The founders promised the forest they would offer a sacrifice every generation, a child to keep the woods silent, the town safe. In return, the town would prosper. Avery's stomach twisted. So the missing children. They're the payment, Hargrove said. But the hollow ones? The ones who came back. Those are the ones the forest rejected, Hargrove replied. The pact requires balance. Those who come back broken are failures. And failures are dangerous. Avery felt the weight of the secret settle around him. You expect me to enforce this pact? Hargrove shook his head. No. You're here to break it. To remember. To end the silence. As dawn crept over Whispering Pines, Avery left the church with a new mission. But breaking centuries-old pacts wasn't simple. It required uncovering buried truths and confronting the darkness that lurked beneath the town's facade. That day, Avery began gathering allies, Lydia, Martha, and a handful of others who had lost loved ones to the Black Tree's hunger. Together, they planned to face the forest, and the Black Tree, to reclaim the forgotten names. That night, under a crescent moon, they returned to Shadow's Hollow. The Black Tree loomed larger than ever, its dark bark pulsing with a sinister life. The air was thick with tension. Avery stepped forward, voice steady but heart pounding. We're here to end the pact. To bring the names back. To stop the hunger. The tree groaned, a sound like bones grinding. From the shadows, figures emerged, the hollow ones. But this time, they didn't whisper. They reached out with empty hands. Avery's allies formed a circle, holding hands and chanting the names they had collected. One by one, the hollow ones' faces flickered, memories returning. The air crackled with energy. Light pierced the darkness. For a moment, it seemed the town's curse might finally lift. But then the ground trembled violently. The Black Tree's bark cracked open, revealing a cavernous void, a mouth ready to swallow. And from within, a voice thundered. The pact cannot be broken. Not yet. The battle for Whispering Pines had only just begun. The tremors beneath Shadow's Hollow had finally ceased, but the weight of what had happened refused to lift. Sheriff Avery Malone stood before the black tree, its twisted bark yawning into an abyss so dark it swallowed all trace of light. The void inside was endless, a blackness that seemed to stretch beyond the very fabric of reality, threatening to consume not only the forest but the town itself. Behind him, a small group gathered quietly, Lydia, Martha, and a few brave souls whose faces were drawn and pale from sleepless nights and mounting dread. They had come together, bound by a shared knowledge too terrible to bear alone. The names they had whispered in ritual, the names carved into worn pages, echoed faintly, like a prayer or a curse, hanging heavy in the air. Avery's hand gripped the leather-bound notebook tighter, the edges frayed from years of use, its pages filled with the stories and names of the lost, those taken by the tree's ancient hunger. These weren't mere legends anymore. They were real, painful, bleeding truths that clung to the bones of Whispering Pines like an invisible shroud. Despite the stillness around them, Avery felt the oppressive presence of the tree pressing against his mind, a silent reminder that the town's nightmare was far from over. In the following days, the town seemed caught in a suspended breath. Life continued on the surface, but beneath, an unease threaded through the streets, twisting conversations into half-formed whispers. The diner buzzed with low talk, punctuated by nervous glances toward the towering pines lining the outskirts. "Have you seen anything strange lately?" a waitress asked a man seated near the counter. He nodded slowly, voice hushed. "They say the hollow ones still wander, but they're not like before, empty, like shadows without souls." Avery sat alone in a corner booth, the bitter taste of cold coffee mingling with his thoughts. Around him, faces blurred, faces weighed down by fear and secrets they were afraid to share aloud. He had become the reluctant keeper of their darkest truth, and the burden pressed heavier with each passing hour. Determined to find answers, Avery visited Lydia's family home. It was a weathered house, its wood worn silver by time, creaking softly beneath the wind's mournful song. Lydia's parents welcomed him with quiet smiles that betrayed the weight of decades of sorrow. In the dim light of their living room, the walls were adorned with aged photographs, sepia-toned images of children and families who once thrived here. Many of those faces bore a strange, unsettling pallor, eyes darkened and hollow, frozen in a moment of fear. Lydia's mother placed a fragile leather-bound journal in Avery's hands. Its cover was cracked and soft, pages brittle with age. "This belonged to my grandfather," she said softly. "He was one of the town's founders, before the pact." Avery opened it carefully. The cursive script was shaky, as though written by a hand trembling with dread. The entries told of the forest's whispers, the founder's fear of the unknown, and a desperate hope for protection, at a terrible cost. One passage stood out. "The forest speaks in riddles. It offers safety, but demands a toll in blood and silence. We feared the price, yet feared even more what would come if we dared to break the pact. The final entry was dated decades ago. Below it, a single word was scrawled with fierce urgency. Regret. That night, Avery dreamed of the black tree. Its branches reached out like skeletal fingers, tracing patterns in the moonlight. A voice, ancient and sorrowful, whispered in his ear. The burden is yours. The silence, your curse. He tried to flee, but the roots wrapped around his ankles, pulling him back toward the gaping darkness. He woke gasping, cold sweat slicking his skin, the nightmare's weight pressing down on his chest like a stone. The line between dream and reality blurred. The next day, Avery called a meeting with the town council. In the cramped room of the old town hall, faces were tense, some angry, some resigned. Avery laid bare the truth, the pact, the lost children, the hollow eyes of the vanished. He told them of the black tree's hunger, and of the growing darkness beneath their feet. Some scoffed, refusing to believe such ancient evils still held sway. Others stared at the floor, haunted and silent. Finally, a man rose, a descendant of the founders. His voice was quiet but firm. We made this pact to protect the town, he said. But maybe the price we pay is more than we can bear. Avery nodded. We had to decide, keep the silence or face the truth. The town voted, reluctantly but unanimously, to confront the black tree at the next full moon. They prepared in whispers and shadows, gathering old relics and charms, rehearsing prayers and protective rites passed down through generations. Fear and hope mingled, twisting into a fragile resolve that held them together. On the night of the full moon, the townspeople gathered around the black tree, their candles flickering in the oppressive dark. Avery led the ceremony, his voice strong as he spoke the names of the lost. One by one, figures emerged from the shadows, the hollow ones, eyes dimly glowing, stepping forward from the abyss. A moment of fragile hope bloomed among the crowd. Then the ground beneath the tree cracked with a violent roar, splitting open to reveal a figure rising, a creature as old as the forest itself, its form a twisted fusion of wood and shadow, eyes blazing with a terrible, ancient wrath. It was the true guardian of the pact, a force beyond understanding or mercy. The crowd gasped and recoiled, the circle broken by fear. Avery stepped forward, heart hammering. This ends tonight, he declared. We will reclaim what was lost. We choose life over silence. For a long, suspended moment, the creature's fiery gaze bore into him. Then, slowly, it receded into the earth, leaving behind a silence heavy with promise and peril. Days later, the black tree still stood, a dark monument to the town's past and uncertain future. But something had changed. The whispers that once shrouded whispering pines began to turn into cautious conversations. Fear did not vanish, but it no longer ruled. Avery often returned to the tree, notebook in hand, feeling the weight of the silent burden he now carried. The story was far from over. The pact was not broken, only rewritten, and the forest was still listening. The dawn after the full moon arrived like a breath held too long, fragile and hesitant. The sun rose slowly over whispering pines, its pale light filtering through dense fog that clung stubbornly to the ground. The town seemed quieter than usual, as if the world itself was recovering from the night's dark reckoning. Yet beneath this fragile calm, something deeper stirred, an undercurrent of unease threading its way through the trees, whispering in voices only the most sensitive could hear. Sheriff Avery Malone paced the edge of Shadow's Hollow, eyes scanning the dense forest that had long been the source of the town's darkest fears. The black tree, ancient and twisted, still stood, its gaping hollow silent but ominous. Avery's hand instinctively rested on the leather-bound notebook he carried, the journal of the lost, the record of the pact, the silent burden he now bore alone. He was not alone in his vigil. Lydia and Martha joined him, their faces pale but resolute, eyes reflecting the same mixture of fear and determination. "We should have seen this coming," Lydia whispered, voice cracking. "The pact, it's not just with the tree. It's with whatever lies beneath it, in the dark." Avery nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. "And whatever it is, it's patient." The three of them stood silently, listening. A faint wind stirred the branches, carrying with it murmurs, soft, elusive whispers, almost too faint to catch. The forest was alive, breathing, watching. It spoke in riddles and half-truths, and Avery felt the weight of those words pressing on his mind. That night, Avery's dreams were tortured by shadows. The black tree's hollow yawned open before him, a void without bottom or end. From its depths came a chorus of lost voices, children's laughter twisted into sobs, warnings whispered on the wind, names called out with desperation. Shadows flickered just beyond his sight, pulling him toward the abyss. He struggled against the pull, heart pounding as cold dread seeped into his bones. He awoke gasping, drenched in sweat, the nightmare's weight pressing down on his chest like a physical force. Determined to understand, Avery reached out to Professor Evelyn Carter, a local historian and expert in occult folklore. Her home was a sanctuary of forgotten knowledge, walls lined with dusty tomes, maps pinned with yellowed notes, candles flickering in the dim light. Avery recounted the story, the pact, the lost children, the hollow ones. Evelyn listened intently, eyes dark with recognition. "The pact was never just a bargain," she said softly. "Shadow's Hollow is a threshold, a liminal space between worlds. The founders sealed something there, a presence older than any of us." She pulled out a fragile manuscript, its leather cracked and pages brittle. "This speaks of the Hollow Ones, spirits trapped between life and death, guardians and prisoners of the forest's curse. They feed the darkness, but they also protect us from worse fates lurking beyond the veil." Avery frowned. So breaking the pact could unleash something even worse. Evelyn nodded gravely. "Yes. But living with the silence is its own kind of death." Days passed with strange sightings reported, flickering lights beneath the black tree, shadows moving just out of sight, whispers carried on the wind. The townspeople grew restless, caught in the web of fear and hope. One evening, compelled by a force he couldn't explain, Avery returned to the tree alone. The forest was unervingly quiet, save for the soft crunch of his footsteps on leaves. As he approached, a faint glow shone from the hollow. Peering inside, he saw faint faces, the lost children, their eyes wide with silent pleas, their mouths moving in mute warnings. Suddenly, a cold hand gripped his wrist, sharp and icy. He spun around, heart racing, but saw no one. Avery realized then, the forest had chosen him. He was not just an observer but a participant, bound by the pact, tied to the fate of whispering pines in ways he was only beginning to understand. As the days turned into weeks, Avery found himself drawn deeper into the mystery. He combed through old records, interviewed elders, and searched for clues buried in the town's forgotten history. Each discovery only added more questions, more shadows. Whispers of a hidden chamber beneath the tree, a place where the founders had met with forces beyond comprehension, began to surface. A place where the original pact was forged in blood and fear. Determined to find it, Avery enlisted Lydia and Martha's help. Together, they ventured into the forest under cover of darkness, guided by cryptic clues from Evelyn's manuscripts and fragments of legend. The deeper they went, the thicker the air became, heavy with the scent of earth and decay, alive with faint murmurs just beyond hearing. Finally, they found it, a narrow entrance, concealed by roots and moss, leading into a tunnel carved from the living rock. The air inside was cold and still, echoing with their footsteps. Walls were etched with symbols, warnings and prayers, names of those lost and those bound by the pact. At the tunnel's end, a chamber opened into darkness. In its center stood an altar, ancient and scarred, stained with age-old blood. Avery approached, heart pounding. As his fingers brushed the altar's surface, a wave of visions crashed over him, scenes of sacrifice, despair, and a desperate hope to protect the town at any cost. He saw the founders, their faces twisted with fear and resolve, making promises they hoped would keep evil at bay. And he saw the cost, the children taken, the souls trapped, the pact's silent burden. A distant growl rumbled through the chamber, shaking the walls. They were not alone. From the shadows emerged figures, the hollow ones, neither alive nor dead, their eyes glowing with an unearthly light. They surrounded the altar, watching, waiting. Avery raised his voice, speaking the names of the lost, invoking the rites from Evelyn's manuscript. The hollow ones paused, their forms flickering. A fragile truce hung in the air. Avery realized then, the pact was a cycle, a story rewritten by each generation. It was both prison and protection. To break it, to free the town, they would have to rewrite the story again, but the cost was unknown. As they emerged from the tunnel, dawn was breaking. The forest seemed quieter now, the whispers softened. But Avery knew this was only the beginning. Whispering pines held many secrets, and some echoes from the hollow were never meant to be silenced. The first pale light of dawn struggled through the dense canopy of whispering pines, casting fragmented shadows that danced like restless spirits over the damp earth. Sheriff Avery Malone stood motionless at the edge of Shadow's Hollow, the air thick with a cold, unnatural stillness that pressed against his skin. He pulled his jacket tighter, but the chill was deeper than any morning breeze. It was the weight of knowledge that clung to him, heavy and inescapable. For days now, the memories of the secret chamber, the ancient altar, the faint smell of iron and earth, the whispered names etched into time, played over and over in his mind. He had seen the hollow ones with his own eyes, ghostly children bound by a curse centuries old, trapped in the liminal space between this world and the next. And the pact, the terrible, desperate agreement that had sealed their fate, loomed over the town like a shadow waiting to swallow them whole. Avery's steps led him back to the town's heart, where a restless energy pulsed beneath the everyday routine. Doors were shut tight earlier than usual, windows dimmed against the encroaching dusk. The townspeople whispered of strange lights beneath the black tree, of voices that carried on the wind like mournful echoes. Some swore they had seen figures darting just beyond the tree-line, spectral and fleeting, their eyes glinting like cold coals. At the sheriff's office, Avery sat staring at his worn hands, the lines and scars a testament to years of protecting this fragile community. But this threat was unlike any he had faced before. It was ancient. It was personal. It was woven into the very roots of whispering pines. That evening, he found himself once again walking the creaking floorboards of Professor Evelyn Carter's study. The room smelled of aging parchment and beeswax, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that seemed to writhe with secrets. Evelyn's eyes met his as he entered, her expression somber and knowing. "You've returned," she said softly, setting aside a tome bound in cracked leather. "I feared the forest's whispers had reached you." Avery nodded. "The pact, it's unraveling. The hollow ones are restless. The town feels it too." Evelyn's gaze darkened. The pact was never meant to endure forever. It was forged in desperation, a binding spell to contain the hollow ones and shield the living from what lies beyond. But every chain corrodes with time. She opened the ancient manuscript to a page filled with faded script and arcane symbols. These spirits, trapped between worlds, demand sacrifice. The souls of children taken to maintain the veil. But as the sacrifice wanes, the veil thins. Avery's voice was barely a whisper. What happens if the pact breaks completely? Evelyn's eyes reflected the flickering candlelight, haunted and grave. The boundary between worlds will tear open. The hollow ones may be freed, but so will darker entities, creatures older and more vengeful than we can imagine. A tense silence fell. Finally, Evelyn spoke. "There is a way to end it, but it is perilous. A ritual must be performed at the black tree during the full moon. It requires blood, voice, and remembrance. It demands sacrifice." The enormity of the choice settled on Avery's shoulders like a stone. But there was no turning back. He reached out to Lydia and Martha, and together they prepared. Old toys, worn clothing, photographs yellowed with age, all relics of the children stolen by the pact, were gathered with trembling hands. The names from the manuscript were copied carefully onto parchment, to be called upon during the ritual. When the night of the full moon arrived, a biting wind swept through whispering pines. The trio ventured deep into Shadow's Hollow, where the black tree stood like a sentinel, its hollow glowing faintly with spectral light. The forest was unnervingly silent, no crickets, no rustling leaves, only the soft crunch of footsteps and the sound of their own breathing. Avery began the chant, his voice steady though his heart thundered. Lydia and Martha joined in, their words weaving a fragile tapestry of memory and mourning, calling out to the lost children. Shadows gathered, twisting into figures, fragile and shimmering. Eyes that held sorrow and hope alike locked onto them. Avery pricked his finger, letting his blood drip onto the altar. Martha faltered, surrendering her voice as the price demanded, while Lydia's resolve hardened like steel. The air thickened, pulsing with unseen power. The boundary between the living and the dead wavered, quivering as if about to snap. Then, with a rush like the breaking of a dam, the hollow ones began to dissolve, drifting away like mist on the wind. The black tree's hollow sealed shut, silence falling like a heavy curtain. The ritual was complete. But Avery knew the darkness was not gone, only held at bay. The echoes of that night would linger, a silent burden carried by whispering pines forever. The uneasy calm that settled over whispering pines after the ritual felt fragile, like a brittle thread stretched too thin. Though the black tree's hollow was sealed and the hollow ones seemed to have dissolved into nothing but memory, the town carried a weight deeper than any before. The townsfolk moved about their days with wary eyes, glancing toward the edge of the forest as if expecting something unseen to emerge. Sheriff Avery Malone could feel it too, a cold pulse beneath the surface, an echo of ancient unrest that no ritual could fully silence. The forest was alive, and it was watching. One evening, as the sky bled the last light of day and the moon rose swollen and pale, Avery was called out to the outskirts. The old Miller farmhouse, abandoned for decades, whispered about in fearful tones, was flickering with shadows. Neighbors reported strange lights dancing behind its broken windows, and a low, sorrowful wailing that carried on the wind. Avery drove slowly down the rutted dirt road, the trees looming like silent sentinels. His flashlight pierced the thick fog that curled around the crumbling house like smoke. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, a faint metallic tang that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. Approaching the house, he felt the temperature drop sharply. His breath puffed white in the cold air as he stepped onto the sagging porch. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and the door creaked open on rusted hinges before his hand even reached the handle. Inside, the house was a frozen moment of decay, peeling wallpaper, shattered glass, and dust motes swirling in the beam of his flashlight. Yet beneath the stillness was a vibration, subtle but insistent, like the pulse of a hidden heartbeat. A soft, almost inaudible whisper drifted from somewhere deeper in the house. Avery's hand tightened on his flashlight as he followed the sound down the narrow staircase into the cellar. The temperature dropped again, colder now, biting through his coat. The cellar was a small, dark space lined with rough stone walls slick with moisture. At its center was a heavy wooden door, slightly ajar, revealing a pitch-black pit beyond. Avery's instincts screamed to turn back, but duty pulled him forward. He called out in a low voice, "Who's there? Show yourself." The silence answered him, thick and suffocating. Then, from the shadows, a pair of eyes glimmered, unblinking, luminescent, and void of humanity. A growl rumbled low in the darkness, a sound from some ancient place between nightmare and reality. Avery stepped back, heart hammering. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. "What do you want?" The creature, or whatever it was, vanished into the blackness, leaving a whisper of sorrow and rage hanging in the damp air. That night, Avery was haunted by dreams that clawed at his mind. He saw the Miller farmhouse consumed by unnatural flames, the faces of children twisted in silent screams, shadows reaching for him with clawed hands. Each nightmare ended with the sound of breaking glass and the echo of distant laughter that chilled his blood. Days passed and the restless energy in Whispering Pines grew stronger. Animals fled the forest's edge, and townsfolk reported hearing footsteps in empty rooms and feeling unseen hands brush past them in the dark. Desperate for guidance, Avery returned to Professor Evelyn Carter. Her study was dimly lit by a single candle, the musty smell of old books thick in the air. The ritual, it wasn't enough, Avery said grimly, rubbing his tired eyes. The house, the shadows, they're still here. Something else is waking. Evelyn nodded slowly, her expression grave. The pact was a temporary seal, a fragile promise made in desperation. Breaking it opened a deeper wound. She pulled out another volume, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. These texts speak of a darker force, an ancient entity tied to the land, older than even the hollow ones. It feeds on fear and suffering, growing stronger as the veil weakens. Avery swallowed hard. How do we stop it? Evelyn looked at him with steady eyes. We prepare. The barrier between worlds is thinning. The coming nights will test the town like never before. You must gather those willing to stand with you. The sheriff left her study with a heavy heart. The coming storm would not be weathered alone. Back in Whispering Pines, he sought out Lydia and Martha once more. Together, they planned to fortify the town's defenses, both physical and spiritual. Old wards were drawn anew, salt lines swept around doorways, candles blessed with herbs were placed on windowsills. But as the full moon waned, the darkness grew bolder. It began with small things, flickering lights, cold spots in warm rooms, whispers too faint to catch but heavy with meaning. Then, the nightmares worsened. Children woke screaming with visions of eyes watching from the trees, their parents unable to soothe their terror. One night, Avery was awakened by pounding at his door. Outside stood a young boy, pale and trembling, eyes wide with fear. They're coming, the boy whispered. The shadows, they want us. The sheriff knew then that the true battle was only beginning. The echoes in the dark were calling, and Whispering Pines would have to face the nightmares it had tried so long to bury. The days following the boy's warning were marked by an unsettling silence that gripped whispering pines. The town's usual hum of life felt muffled, as if sound itself was being swallowed by an unseen force. Windows stayed shuttered, conversations dropped to whispers, and the once bright streets grew dimmer under the weight of dread. Sheriff Avery Malone moved through this creeping gloom like a man walking a tightrope over an abyss. His mind was a tangle of fear and resolve, his eyes scanning every shadow for signs of the growing darkness. Lydia and Martha, ever his stalwart allies, worked alongside him, their efforts to protect the town from the unseen terror as tireless as they were desperate. At night, the forest seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The trees whispered in voices both ancient and sorrowful, their branches clawing at the sky as though trying to tear open the very fabric between worlds. The black tree, once sealed and silent, now pulsed faintly with an eerie glow, its hollow throat a dark mouth waiting to devour. One evening, Avery stood near the edge of the hollow, the air thick with a cold so biting it seemed to freeze his very soul. The moon hung high, full and impossibly bright, casting ghostly light on the twisted roots and tangled undergrowth. Suddenly, a rustle, soft, deliberate, came from the shadows. Avery's hand went instinctively to his holster, but his eyes found only a small figure stepping into the moonlight. It was the boy again, the same pale child who had warned him days before. But now, the boy's eyes shone with something deeper, an ancient knowledge that belied his youthful face. "They're coming," the boy whispered. "The veil is fraying. The hollow ones want to cross over." Avery felt a chill run down his spine. "How do we stop it?" he asked, voice tight. The boy shook his head slowly. "You can't. Not alone. You need to remember. The stories. The sacrifices. The pact. It wasn't just a prison. It was a balance." The weight of the boy's words settled over Avery like a stone. He realized then that their battle was no longer just to protect the town, but to understand the darkness that had shaped it from the beginning. Back in town, the signs of the veil's weakening grew more pronounced. Lights flickered wildly. Animals fled into the woods, their cries piercing the night. People awoke in cold sweats, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures reaching through walls and windows. Avery, Lydia, and Martha gathered in the sheriff's office, surrounded by ancient texts and hastily drawn words. They spoke in hushed tones, piecing together fragmented histories and forgotten rites. "The pact was never meant to be broken without consequence," Lydia said, tracing the faded ink of a centuries-old manuscript. "It was a fragile thread holding back a tide of darkness. Now that it's torn, the town is vulnerable." Martha's eyes were fierce. "Then we fight. We gather the townsfolk. We prepare for what's coming." But preparation was only the beginning. The veil was thinning, and with each passing night, the boundary between the living and the dead blurred further. Shadows moved with intent. Voices whispered promises and threats alike. The hollow ones, once silent, now sang mournful songs carried on the wind. As the full moon reached its zenith, Avery found himself once again beneath the black tree. The air was electric with unseen power. From the hollow emerged flickering figures, children bound by sorrow, their faces pale and eyes hollow. They spoke not with words but with emotion, pain, loss, longing. Avery reached out, feeling the cold of their touch and the weight of their plea. The ritual had freed them from their prison, but it had also unleashed something darker, a hunger that could not be sated by mere memory or sacrifice. In that moment, Avery understood the truth. To protect Whispering Pines, they would have to confront not only the Hollow Ones but the ancient evil that had bound them all. The forest's heart beat with a malevolent will, and only by facing it could the town hope to survive. The battle ahead would test their courage, their faith, and their very souls. And in the dark corners of Whispering Pines, the shadows waited, patient, relentless, and hungry. The veil between the worlds had weakened, and Whispering Pines was beginning to unravel. It started quietly, with small, unsettling incidents that the townsfolk tried to dismiss as coincidence or imagination. But Avery Malone, the sheriff, knew better. The shadows creeping at the edges of vision, the sudden chills, the whispered voices that no one could quite place, all were signs that the darkness was growing bolder. One evening, a cold wind swept through the town, carrying with it the faintest hint of rot and decay. Avery stood on the porch of his home, the weight of the recent days pressing down on him. His eyes scanned the horizon where the forest met the sky, a place now tinged with a sinister energy. Suddenly, a voice called out from the darkness. Avery. He spun around, flashlight cutting through the gloom, but saw no one. Just the whisper of the wind and the rustling of leaves. Days later, reports of disappearances started coming in. Teenagers who had been seen near the forest's edge vanished without a trace. Pets and livestock were found mutilated. The townsfolk grew restless, their fear simmering beneath the surface like a volcano ready to erupt. At the sheriff's office, Avery, Lydia, and Martha pored over old records and folklore, desperate for a solution. There has to be a way to push them back, Lydia insisted, her fingers tracing the fragile pages of an ancient tome. Martha shook her head. The barrier is thinning too fast. Whatever holds them back is failing. One night, Avery received a frantic call. A group of local teenagers had gone into the forest and hadn't returned. Gathering a search party, Avery led the way into the woods, the trees looming like silent judges. As they ventured deeper, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Suddenly, the flashlight beams caught movement, a pale figure darting behind a tree. Heart pounding, Avery called out, but the figure vanished like smoke. Deeper into the woods, they found the teenagers huddled in a small clearing, faces pale and eyes wide with terror. They were following me, one whispered. The shadows, they want to take us. Avery scanned the trees, feeling eyes watching from the darkness. We need to get back, he said firmly. That night, the shadows seemed to press closer to the town. Lights flickered, and strange shapes moved in the periphery. The Hollow Ones, no longer confined, roamed freely, feeding on fear and sorrow. Back at the sheriff's office, Avery and his allies faced a grim truth. The ancient pact had been broken, and with it, the balance between worlds. To restore it, a sacrifice was needed, one tied to the original bond with the Hollow Ones. Evelyn Carter, the local historian, explained, only blood bound to the original pact can mend the veil. The revelation was a knife to the heart. Among them were descendants of those first who had sealed the pact. The cost was personal. Preparations began for a ritual under the next full moon. Townsfolk gathered, some in fear, others in determination. The lines between ally and enemy blurred as the darkness whispered promises of power to the weak-willed. On the night of the ritual, the forest pulsed with malevolent energy. The air was thick with tension and unspoken dread. Avery stood at the center of the circle, flanked by Lydia and Martha, each holding tokens of protection and remembrance. The ritual commenced with chants from the ancient tongue, voices trembling but resolute. As the ceremony reached its climax, shadows erupted from the forest, clawing and screaming, desperate to break through. The townsfolk held the line, their courage a fragile shield against the encroaching nightmare. Avery felt a searing pain as the sacrifice was made, a bond reforged in blood and sorrow. Slowly, the shadows recoiled, retreating into the forest depths. The veil mended, but at a terrible cost. Whispering Pines was saved, for now. But Avery knew the darkness would return. It was patient and eternal, waiting for the moment the veil frayed once more. The town was forever changed, its scars etched into the very soil and souls of its people. And somewhere, beyond the edge of the forest, the Hollow Ones waited. The aftermath of the ritual left Whispering Pines in a fragile state. The oppressive darkness that had suffocated the town receded like a retreating tide, leaving behind an eerie silence that settled heavily over the streets and homes. Yet, despite the apparent peace, Avery Malone could feel the residue of something far more sinister still lurking beneath the surface, something ancient and hungry, stirring restless beneath the pines. The town had changed. The forest seemed alive in ways it never had been before. Its shadows deepened, seeming to shift and writhe just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. The air was thick with tension, an invisible pulse beating beneath the soil, as if the woods themselves held their breath. Lydia spent countless hours buried in old texts and journals, poring over the faded handwriting of those long gone, desperate for a clue to what might come next. One rainy afternoon, she came into the sheriff's office, her face drawn and pale, clutching a brittle, leather-bound book. "Avery," she said quietly, her voice trembling, "I think I found something that explains the restless presence." The pact wasn't just a simple agreement, it created echoes. Fragmented souls trapped between this world and the next. They're caught in limbo, unable to cross over. Martha, who had accompanied Lydia, opened her own journal, worn and faded. "These echoes," she said, "they aren't just memories or spirits. They're remnants of people who were tied to the original pact, but somehow left behind, their souls fractured and trapped in the space between. and the thinning veil has been allowing them to leak through. Avery felt the weight of their discovery settle over him like a shroud. So the ritual sealed the veil, but it didn't free those souls. No, Lydia replied, eyes distant. It's more complicated. The veil was mended, but these echoes remain, restless, angry, confused. They're beginning to influence the living. That very night, the consequences of their failure made themselves known. The town was first shaken by strange phenomena, lights flickering in houses long abandoned, whispered voices in empty rooms, and shadows that seemed to move independently of any source. The dogs in town howled without cause, and even the bravest townsfolk locked their doors early. A call came in from the edge of town, near the old mill, a structure long disused and decaying, where many whispered of hauntings. Residents reported ghostly lights and chilling sounds emanating from within. Avery assembled a small group, Lydia, Martha, and a few deputies. The night was moonless, the sky a blanket of thick clouds that swallowed any starlight. The forest loomed ahead, trees like black sentinels guarding a secret. As they approached the mill, the air grew colder, the dampness clinging to their skin and seeping into their bones. The wooden structure creaked ominously, shadows pooling in every corner. Suddenly, a figure appeared before them, a child, translucent and glowing faintly. Her eyes were wide and empty, filled with sorrow and desperation. "I'm trapped," the apparition whispered, voice barely more than a breath. "Help us." Avery swallowed the lump in his throat, stepping closer. "Who are you? What happened here?" The child's form flickered as if fighting to maintain shape. "We were bound by the pact, left behind when the veil was sealed. Now we wait, waiting to be free." Behind her, more figures began to emerge, broken, ghostly shapes twisted by time and torment, reaching out with hollow hands. The atmosphere thickened with tension as the forest around them seemed to pulse, alive with dark energy. A low growl echoed, distant but growing louder, as the hollow ones stirred, sensing the disruption. Avery's voice was steady but edged with urgency. "We'll find a way to help you. You're not alone." But the warning was clear. The veil might have been patched, but the damage was far from healed. The echoes beneath the pines were restless, their silent torment bleeding into the waking world. As they retreated from the mill, the oppressive darkness seemed to follow, a lingering presence that whispered of vengeance and sorrow. Back in town, whispers spread like wildfire. The hollow ones were no longer just stories, they were real, and they were coming. Avery sat alone late into the night, staring at the fire's dying embers. His mind raced with questions and fears. The battle for Whispering Pines was far from over. The forest held secrets darker than anyone had imagined. The shadows beneath the pines were alive, and they remembered. They were waiting. Dawn broke over Whispering Pines like a pale, trembling promise. The mist that curled through the streets clung stubbornly to rooftops and lampposts, refusing to dissipate even as the sun edged above the horizon. It was as though the town itself were reluctant to face the day, still haunted by the shadows that lurked in every corner. Sheriff Avery Malone stood at the edge of his front porch, hands jammed into the pockets of his weathered jacket. He watched the mist roll in from the forest, felt the tension crackle in the air like static. After the mill incident and the flood of restless echoes, Whispering Pines had grown quiet, too quiet. Word of the ritual's failure had spread, and people whispered of second chances and dark bargains, of friends and relatives behaving oddly, as though some piece of their soul had slipped away. Lydia arrived just as Avery was turning to retreat indoors. Her face was drawn, eyes rimmed with fatigue and dark rings, but her pace was urgent. "Avery," she said, breathless with the cold, "we have to move now. I found the Whispering Roots on a map from 1892, hand-drawn, in Martha's grandmother's handwriting. It's a burial ground, but not for bodies. It's for something older." Avery nodded, smelling coffee and fear on her breath. "Tell me everything." They hurried inside, where Martha waited in front of a bulletin board plastered with yellowed maps, faded photographs of children, and newspaper clippings from decades of disappearances. A single light bulb swung overhead, casting the room in a sickly sway of illumination and shadow. Lydia pointed to the map. "Here. In the hollow beneath the oldest pines. It's a natural clearing, but the roots rise from the ground like veins. The Founder's Journal calls it the breathing earth. It's not a graveyard for people, but for echoes." Martha added in a whisper, "Legends say the echoes are tethered here, unable to cross fully back into our world. If we can sever the tether, maybe we can calm them, or finally set them free." Avery studied their faces, knew the risk. "We go tonight. Full moon. If the echoes are growing stronger, we can't wait." They assembled a small, trusted team of deputies: Caleb Blake, a grizzled veteran with a half-mile of scars and a hesitant faith in Avery's leadership, and Jess Ramirez, the youngest deputy whose unwavering courage was the town's best hope. They stocked first aid kits, lice-wicking lanterns, salt, sage, and the collection of carved stones Lydia had unearthed, tokens meant to bind restless spirits. At twilight, they set out on foot, winding along the dirt road that led into Whispering Pines' most ancient forest. The pines grew taller here, thousands of years old, their trunks twisting skyward like silent monks in perpetual prayer. The air was colder beneath the canopy, and the forest floor was an ocean of damp needles and tangled roots. Avery led the way by compass and memory. The moon rose full and cold, a silver lantern in the sky. Shadows gathered at the edges of his vision. Every now and then, the forest seemed to exhale, branches creaking, murmurings drifting through the trees. After nearly an hour, they came to the clearing Lydia had marked. The roots here were massive, gnarled and bulging, rising from the earth like the arteries of some primeval creature. Moss clung to their sinewy curves, and the ground between them sank into shadow. "You feel that?" Jess whispered, voice trembling. "It's like a heartbeat." Avery knelt and pressed his hand to the soil. A faint thrum pulsed beneath his palm, as if the ground itself were alive. A hush fell, the team exchanging strained glances. Caleb produced a small lantern and placed it at Avery's feet, its golden glow painting the roots in grotesque relief. Lydia unrolled her journal. We need to carve the names deeply into the stones, set them around the circle, and chant. The rhythm of our voices has to match the heartbeat of the roots. Then we pour the salt and the blood token. She held up a silver dagger donated by Evelyn Carter, to seal the echo's passage. Avery inhaled, steeling himself. Let's, for the children of whispering pines, do what must be done. They arranged the stones in a ring around the clearing, each one etched with a name: Maren Cole, Clara Worth, Danny Fisher, Lydia Marshall, and dozens more. The lanterns formed a ring of light, and the men and women took positions behind them, backs to the trees, eyes on the roots' dark coils. Lydia began the chant, her voice a low, steady murmur. By the blood of the bound, by the breath of the ground, by the names we reclaim, we sever your chain. One by one, the others joined, their voices weaving a tapestry of sound into the night air. The roots thrummed in answer, the earth humming beneath their feet. Shadows writhed at the edge of the lantern light, shapes that flickered and dissolved. Avery unsheathed the silver dagger, pricked his finger, and let a single drop of blood fall onto the nearest stone. The metal glinted red, and the earth shuddered. Now salt, he said, tossing handfuls around the circle's edge. The grains sizzled as they touched the soil, a whispered hiss that rose to a roar in Avery's ears. The roots writhed violently, rising from the ground like serpents. The team staggered backward, hands raised to protect themselves. The lanterns guttered, and cold, shadowy forms emerged, echoes, pale and twisted, their eyes glowing with sorrow and rage. Jess fired her service weapon at one figure, but the bullet passed through, the spirit's form dissolving into mist. Caleb barked orders to form ranks, but Avery stood his ground. Hold the circle, he shouted. Keep chanting. The voices rose, dissonant at first, then harmonizing into a single force. The echoes screamed, a sound that split the night, yet the chant never wavered. A pressure built in the clearing, as if the forest itself pressed down on them. The roots writhed higher, threatening to whip the circle shut. Lydia's voice cracked, but Martha steadied her. Together. Martha called. Together. They formed a human chain, voices rising in unison, salt and blood tokens passed from hand to hand. The stones glowed a faint ember red, and the ground trembled. With a final, resonant verse, they shouted. By the roots of the pines. By the wellspring of time. By the echo of names. We claim back their graves. A blinding pulse of light erupted from the circle's center. The lanterns exploded outward, snuffing every wick. The world spun into brilliant white, then dropped into absolute silence. When Avery opened his eyes, he lay on the cold earth under a yawning sky lit by dawn's first light. The clearing was still, the roots lay dormant again, sinking back into the ground. The stones were dark and unremarkable, the names barely visible. He sat up, chest heaving. Lydia knelt beside him, tears streaking her dirt-smeared face. "It's done," she whispered. Jess staggered forward, face pale. I don't feel them anymore." Caleb dusted off his jacket. "No shadows at the edge. No whispers." Avery looked around, heart pounding. The forest was silent, truly silent, for the first time in months. He reached out and touched the nearest root. It was cold, inert, like any other tree. They gathered their lanterns and departed the clearing, leaving behind the whispering roots. In the days that followed, whispering pines found a fragile peace. The lingering cold spots vanished, footprints in the forest ceased, and for the first time in generations, the townspeople slept through the night without waking to whispered calls. At the sheriff's office, Avery placed the journal and the salt-stained stones into an evidence locker. The battle had been won, but the cost was etched into every soul there. Lydia and Martha exchanged weary smiles that held both relief and sorrow. One evening, as Avery walked home under a sky bright with stars, he paused at the forest's edge. The pines stood silent, their needles quivering softly in the night breeze. He pressed a hand to the bark of the nearest tree, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Rest now." A faint rustle answered him, a final sigh of release. Whispering pines would never again be haunted by the echoes beneath the roots. But the memory remained, a reminder that some bargains exact a price beyond reckoning, and that courage, and unity, could reclaim even the darkest of legacies. And in the hush of the forest, the pines whispered back, at peace at last. The dawn sun filtered through the towering pines, gilding their needles in an otherworldly silver light. Whispering pines stirred to life, its streets quieter now, as if the town were awakening from a profound, shared dream. The horrors of the past moons, rituals, echoes, restless spirits, had receded, leaving scars but also a fragile hope. Sheriff Avery Malone walked the length of Main Street, tipping his hat to shopkeepers who offered nods of cautious greeting. He sensed the change in the air, the forest felt hollow, as though a great weight had been lifted. Yet deep down, he knew their victory was only one chapter in a longer story. Inside the sheriff's office, Lydia and Martha were already at work. The evidence locker lay open, its contents, salted stones, torn parchments, blood-tinted daggers, arranged on the desk. Martha's fingers trailed lovingly over each relic, as though bidding farewell to old companions. "We did it," Lydia said softly, eyes misty. "The echoes are gone, or at least at peace." Avery nodded, though a restless flutter in his chest refused to settle. "We mended the veil," he said, "but the forest still breathes with memories. I can feel it in every breeze." Martha looked up. "Maybe it's time the town honored that memory, build something permanent, some monument so we never forget." Lydia smiled wryly. "A memorial? I like it." Avery grinned in relief. "Let's plan it at the town meeting tonight." That evening, as dusk deepened, the townsfolk gathered in the community hall, once a lively place of dances and bazaars, now echoing with hushed anticipation. Chairs were arranged in rows, and torches lined the walls, their flickering light casting long, quivering shadows. Avery stood at the front, Lydia and Martha flanking him. The murmurs died down. "We stand here tonight," Avery began, "united by hardship and by hope. We faced darkness together, and we prevailed. But wounds remain, wounds in our hearts, in our homes, in the forest we call neighbor." He paused, scanning the crowd. "I propose we build a memorial in the Whispering Roots clearing. A place to remember those lost, to honor those who fought, and to remind future generations of the value of vigilance and unity." A murmur of approval rippled through the hall. An elderly woman rose. A simple stone circle, perhaps, with names inscribed. And room for new names, should the need ever arise. A young father added, "A planting of evergreens, to remind us that life endures even in darkness." The ideas flowed, benches carved from local wood, plaques recounting the town's history, and an annual ceremony under the full moon. By night's end, plans were set. The town would journey once more to the clearing, but this time not for fear or ritual, but for remembrance and healing. 2 nights later, under a sky bejeweled with stars, the townspeople assembled at the edge of the ancient forest. Lanterns dotted the path like terrestrial constellations. Children clutched carved wooden tokens, parents held photographs, and elders carried sprigs of pine and candles. At the clearing, the Whispering Roots lay silent. The massive, gnarled veins of the earth had settled back into stillness. Avery, Lydia, and Martha stepped forward, laying the first stones in a perfect circle. Each stone bore a name: Marin Cole, Clara Worth, Danny Fisher, and dozens more, names that once belonged to frightened children and restless spirits, now honored in memory. Avery placed the last stone at the circle's apex. "We remember you," he intoned, voice carrying across the hush. "Your stories are woven into the soil of this town. You rest now in peace." Lydia lit the torches around the circle. Martha released lanterns into the sky, their soft glow drifting upward. The townspeople joined hands, a living ring of solidarity. A gentle breeze stirred the pines, and faintly, almost imperceptibly, the forest seemed to sigh. Afterward, by the light of campfires, Avery reflected with Lydia and Martha on the journey they had undertaken. The forest's darkness had tested them, but their unity had prevailed. The echoes were at rest, the veil healed, and Whispering Pines had reclaimed its soul. Yet as they turned to leave, Martha paused at the edge of the clearing, gaze fixed on the silvered canopy above. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. Avery and Lydia fell silent, listening. A soft murmur rose on the night breeze, a rustling of leaves, a breath from the ancient pines. But it was not a sigh of sorrow or despair. It was a lullaby, gentle, melodic, and full of remembrance. They stood together, hearts light with hope, as the Whispering Pines sang its song of healing beneath the silver canopy. The dawn after the memorial ceremony brought a fragile serenity to Whispering Pines. Sunlight filtered through the pines in warm shafts, illuminating dewdrops clinging to needles like scattered diamonds. The town itself seemed to breathe easier. Children laughed again in the schoolyard, and shopkeepers greeted neighbors with genuine smiles. For the first time in months, there was a sense that life might return to normal. But Avery Malone, sheriff of Whispering Pines, knew that true peace was never so easily won. The forest had offered a lullaby beneath its silver canopy, but lullabies could lull the unwary into complacency. He still felt the thrum of something vast and patient stirring beneath the roots, a presence older and more enduring than he. That morning, as Avery made his rounds, he noticed small, unsettling details, footprints leading to the edge of the woods that did not match any shoes in town, shards of broken lantern glass scattered under a lone pine, and the faintest echo of whispered laughter carried on the breeze. He filed each observation away, determined not to ignore any hint of the darkness's return. By midday, Lydia joined him in the sheriff's office, her eyes bright with purpose. In her hands she held a stack of letters, handwritten notes sent from families far beyond town lines. "Avery, look at this," she said. "These aren't just memories, they're warnings." He read the first letter aloud. "I write from Timbers Crossing, Oregon. We faced something like yours last fall, voices in the trees, children drawn into the woods. You cured the echoes, but we learned the same darkness travels on the wind. It looks for towns with old wounds." Next, Martha placed maps on the desk, each marked with a faint circle around tiny towns at the edge of great forests, places once thriving, now silent. "It's spreading," Martha said. "It's not confined to Whispering Pines. The forest's breath carries it farther than we ever imagined." Avery's jaw tightened. "Then we need to warn them, help them prepare. We can't let the darkness leap from one forgotten town to the next." That evening, Avery convened an emergency meeting in the community hall. The dozen faces assembled showed a mixture of pride over their memorial success and renewed concern. Avery laid out the letters and maps, explaining the threat that reached beyond their borders. "This isn't just our fight anymore," he said. "We've seen what happens when the forest's curse moves on. We must stand sentinel, not just for ourselves, but for others who may not have the knowledge we've gained." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Plans formed to reach out to neighboring towns, sheriff's departments in Timbers Crossing, Cedar Hollow, Frostvale, sharing rituals, protective symbols, and the names of those lost so they, too, might build their own memorial circles. A group of volunteers stepped forward. Lydia and Martha would train contingent teams in the rites and protections. Avery would travel to the nearest town to establish the first line of communication. Caleb and Jess would prepare a supply of warding stones and herbal wards for distribution. As they finalized plans, a hush fell over the hall. A single knock sounded at the door. Deputy Ramirez entered, face pale. "Sheriff Malone, you need to see this." Out on Maple Avenue, under the glow of the street lamps, a small crowd had gathered. At the edge of the pavement lay a single, small shoe, childlike, weathered, and damp with dew. No child stood nearby. Avery knelt, noting the shoe's scuffed toe and tiny frayed lace. His heart clenched. Across the street, the forest's edge felt darker, deeper, an open mouth waiting to swallow. "This is a warning," he said quietly, standing. "We begin tonight." Under the new moon, the first of the town emissaries gathered at the Whispering Roots clearing. Lydia and Martha led the ceremony, demonstrating the protective circle, the chant, and the scattering of salt and ashwood ash. Volunteers took turns standing watch, lanterns forming a ring of light in the darkness. Avery walked the circle's perimeter, lantern in hand, every sense alert. When the first gust of wind rose from the woods, chill and whispering, he nodded to Martha, who raised her voice in the ancient incantation. The wind stilled. The forest held its breath. A single figure emerged from the trees, a woman in a dark cloak, eyes wide with recognition. She stepped into the circle's lantern glow. "My name is Clara Beaumont," she said. "I'm from Timbers Crossing. We received your letter, and tonight, the voices called there again." Avery offered her his hand. "You're safe here. We'll help you protect your town, just as we protected ours." Behind Clara, more figures appeared, messengers, seekers, families who refused to be silent. As the circle held fast, the wind whispered through the pines, but no voices answered. The forest tested them, and found them ready. By dawn, the emissaries had formed an alliance of forest border towns, sharing knowledge of warding stones, ritual chants, and the memory of lives lost. Whispering Pines stood at the center of a growing network of guardians, bound by shared vigilance. Avery watched the sunrise from the forest's edge, the morning mist now dissipating under golden light. He felt, at last, a sense of purpose beyond his original duty, an understanding that their small town story had grown into a beacon of hope and resistance. The forest, ancient and eternal, would carry on. But so would they, the guardians of Whispering Pines and beyond, standing watch beneath the pines, ensuring that no echo, no desperate fragment of the past, would slip through again to haunt the living. And as Avery walked back into town, the wind sighed through the trees, a sound neither sorrowful nor joyous, but triumphant in its quiet promise. The hollow horizon had been held at bay, and the light of remembrance would never fade. The dawn light that broke over Whispering Pines on the 21st day carried both promise and warning. The pines shimmered in the fragile glow of sunrise, but beneath their beauty lay a tremor of urgency, an unspoken reckoning that pulsed in every breath of wind. Sheriff Avery Malone rose before dawn, haunted by dreams of roots wrapping around his ankles, pulling him into the earth. He dressed silently, loading his patrol car with salt, warding stones, and the ancient journals that had guided them this far. Tonight would be their final stand. By mid-morning, the town buzzed with preparation. Under Lydia's and Martha's direction, volunteers worked in teams, carving names into new stones, mixing salt with powdered ashwood, weaving protective charms of twisted pine and sage. Every able hand carried a lantern or a bag of salt, each person determined that Whispering Pines would never again be a place of silent fear. At high noon, Avery convened a council in the community hall, its walls now lined with photographs of past ceremonies and memorials. "We've learned much," he declared, voice firm, "but the forest's darkness still gathers at our edge. Tonight, we confront what lies beyond the whispering roots. Tonight, we make our last stand." They left the hall with a hand-drawn map, 3 concentric defenses in the Whispering Roots clearing. The first, a ring of warding stones and salt barriers. The second, standing stones inscribed with every lost name. The third, the very center, reserved for Avery, Lydia, and Martha to perform the binding ritual that would seal this place forever. As dusk fell, volunteers assembled in the clearing. Lanterns flickered to life, casting wavering circles of gold. Caleb Blake and Jess Ramirez took positions at the outer ring, their lanterns held high as they scattered salt and placed warding stones at 11-foot intervals. Each protective glyph glowed faintly, humming with ancient power. Inside that circle marched Lydia and Martha, bearing pillars of carved stone bearing names: Maren Cole, Clara Worth, Danny Fisher, Lydia Marshall, Jonah Kent, Mara Fletcher, Raymond Myers, Rebecca Jennings, Noah Reed, and dozens more. Under Lydia's precise guidance, they placed the pillars in a perfect ring, inscriptions facing outward toward the forest. At each quadrant, volunteers spoke the names aloud in steady whispers, a tapestry of remembrance woven into the night air. Under the moonless sky, Avery, Martha, and Lydia stood at the very center beside a simple altar, an unadorned slab etched with runes and girded by 5 iron sconces, each holding a white candle. Avery's voice rang out, "We stand on this sacred ground to honor the lost, uphold their memory, and guard the living against the darkness." One by one they lit the candles. The flames leapt to life, gilding their faces in solemn firelight. Without warning, a cold gust ripped through the clearing. The outer lanterns bobbed like startled eyes. From the forest's edge emerged writhing masses of shadow, shapes twisted by sorrow and rage. Jess and Caleb braced themselves, chanting the binding phrase Lydia had taught them: "By salt and stone, by name and bone, we stand our ground, darkness confound." The warding stones glowed, and the shadows shrieked before recoiling. Yet skeletal figures cloaked in tattered shrouds slipped through the gaps, emissaries of the forest's ancient hunger. Volunteers flung salt and raised warding stones high, but a phantom lunged past the barrier, grazing a deputy's coat and sending her sprawling. Avery sprang forward, planting his own glyph-encrusted stone into the ground. A flare of golden light engulfed the spectre, dissolving it into drifting ash. The struggle barely paused before smaller, childlike silhouettes appeared, echoes of the lost children, their hollow eyes pleading rather than menacing. Martha surged ahead, her voice rising in the remembrance chant: "Spirits lost across the veil, touch this earth where memories pale. Remembered now, your names resound, in stone and heart you're safe and found." The echoes faltered, their anguished forms softening. One by one they drifted backward into the forest gloom, soothed by her words. A tremor shook the clearing, a deeper, more ancient power stirring. The trees groaned, their trunks bending inward until from the darkness stepped a colossal figure, taller than any man, its form woven of bark and vine, Where its face should have been, a mass of roots crowned with pine needles pulsed with green fire. This was the guardian of the pact, summoned by the night's upheaval. Avery felt his bones rattle at its silent roar. The guardian swept a massive hand, and warding stones shattered like glass, lanterns extinguished in a ripple of darkness, and standing stones cracked along their inscriptions. Volunteers screamed and fled as vines lashed out, tearing at their legs. Jess fired wildly. Her bullets passed harmlessly through the guardian's bark-like robes. Avery's heart pounded as he realized they faced the very embodiment of the forest's ancient judgment. Then, in the hush that followed, Avery saw his chance. He sprinted to the center, where Lydia and Martha gripped the ancient journal. "It seeks atonement, not destruction," he shouted. "We must invoke the Founder's prayer, offer ourselves as guardians alongside it." Lydia opened the journal, voice unwavering. "We speak the vow made centuries past to bind our souls in service, not prison, by pine and root, by earth and blood, we vow our watch in timeless flood. No chain of fear, no blade of wrath, but love and guard on this shared path." Martha added her voice, crystal clear against the forest's stillness. "We renew the bond of memory and protection." Avery stepped forward, hand pressed to his heart. "I swear my life to this town, to these woods, to the memory of every lost soul. In service, not in bondage, I offer my watch." The lines of light returned, warding stones reformed, standing stones mended, names gleaming in the renewed glow. The guardian's crowned root head dipped, its vast form bowing before them. Echoes, dozens of pale children, emerged in a final procession, their faces alight with sorrow and gratitude. They drifted upward, merging into the pine's silver canopy until only the hush of midnight remained. When dawn broke, the clearing lay transformed. The warding stones glowed softly, a protective ring at the forest's threshold. The standing stones formed a permanent circle of remembrance, names clear against the weathered rock. At the center, the iron sconces stood empty, their candlesticks melted down to ash. Relics of the night whispering pines chose unity over fear. In the weeks and months that followed, Avery, Lydia, Martha, Caleb, and Jess became known as the Watchers, guardians of a new promise born of shared sacrifice and love. They trained successors to tend the warding stones, lead the annual remembrance, and pass on the vows that bound their hearts to the forest's fate. Under the silver canopy of the pines, whispering pines thrived. Children played beneath the trees, their laughter bright in the morning light. Travelers speaking of dark woods and lost souls found open doors and knowing smiles. And when the night wind rustled through the needles, it carried a gentle lullaby of unity and hope, a song of lives reclaimed and legacies secured. No darkness could endure where love stood guard, and the folly of the forest itself whispered, the pact was no prison, but a covenant of memory and protection, ever watchful beneath the whispering roots. The storm may have passed, but in the woods of whispering pines, the echoes never truly fade. Thank you for drifting into the dark with me tonight. If your eyes are still open, close them now. Let the whispers carry you to sleep. Subscribe if you'd like to return, because there are more stories buried in the shadows, waiting for you. Good night. And remember, some oaths are never broken.